Hey, what's going on everyone? It is Kyle and we're back with another episode of my programming and web development tutorials. This is episode 8 of my C++ programming tutorials, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about vectors. So before we jump in and do any programming, I'll actually just briefly explain what vectors are. So if you're watching a couple of episodes ago where we were talking about arrays, vectors are extremely similar to arrays, but the main difference between a vector and an array is that vectors actually let you modify the size of the array, meaning that you can add extra elements and remove elements and remove a range of elements and do a whole bunch of other stuff within your actual vector, which kind of makes it a more dynamic version of an array if you think about it like that. So in most cases where you're working with data that you don't really know the size of, so say if you were pulling records from a database or something like that and for some reason you needed to store them in some kind of array, then a vector would be the best way to go about doing that, because you don't actually know how big it's going to be, so you can't actually define a size, and then the vector additionally will let you add and remove elements as you see fit as well. Okay, so let's jump into code blocks and we will type out our main skeleton of our program, and then we will continue with our vectors. So we'll include IOStream, we'll also include string for this episode as well. And to be able to use vectors, you also need to include the vector header as well. So we'll type out the rest of our application here. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to show you guys how to actually create a vector in C++. So it's pretty simple. What you need to do is you just say normal std : and then say vector. Okay, and then in between a greater than and a less than and a greater than symbol, you need to actually supply the type of vector that you're going to be creating, which in this case will be a string vector, if I could spell it. Okay, so first of all, you're probably wondering what this actually does, and I will probably discuss this in an upcoming episode in more detail, because it's probably more suited for an episode by itself. But basically all you need to know at this stage is this is actually just stating what type of vector you are going to be creating. So in this case, it's a string vector. And then you need to supply your vector with a name, so we're just going to call it my vector. And then we're going to supply it with some values in curly braces, and then we just put in our bunch of string values separated by commas. So we'll say my name is Bob. Okay, cool. So that's our vector created. So we've just created a vector with 4 elements inside of it. So the first thing I'm going to show you guys, or the second thing I'm going to show you guys, is actually how to access an element within your vector, because that as well is slightly different to accessing an element within an array. So we're just going to print out one of the elements using cout. So we'll go std cout, and then we're going to call our vector, so my vector dot at. So what this is actually saying is my vector basically dot at position, so, or at index, and then in brackets we need to supply it with the argument of the index that we want to be printed out on the screen. So in this case we'll just go 3. Okay, so my vector dot at index 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3. So in theory, if everything goes well, we should actually have Bob printed out onto the screen. So we'll run it and we'll find out. Okay, as you can see, we've got Bob printed out on the screen, so we know that that's worked correctly. And that's how you actually access an element within a vector. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add an element to the vector. So in this case, we're going to give Bob a last name. He doesn't have one, and he looks like he needs one. So what we're going to do again is call my vector. Still can't spell it. My vector dot pushback. It's always hard to remember that one. Push back. Okay, and the arguments that this one takes is simply the value that is to be inserted into the element on the end. So in this case, we're going to give Bob his last name of Jones, and what that will actually do is create another element and place that value inside of it. And to prove that that has actually occurred, we will do the same thing we did at the start, and we will print out on the screen myVector.at, and instead of supplying 3, we're going to supply 4, because now we've got an extra element. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so then when we run it, we should actually get Jones printed out on the screen instead. And as you can see, that has also worked correctly, so we know that that's working as well. Okay, so we have added an element to the end of an array, of our vector, sorry. But what if you wanted to actually add an element somewhere else besides just the end? It's all well and good to just keep adding it onto the end, but if you wanted to, say, add something to the start, how would you do that? So to add something to the start, what you need to actually do is, again, call myVector. And then you want to call the insert function. That should be a little bit easier to remember. And the insert function actually takes 2 arguments. It will take the position that you want to insert it in and the value. So whereas this one just takes the value because you're only inserting it onto the end, this one actually takes what position you would like to insert the value and the value that you would like to insert. So in this case, we're going to call, or we're going to say myVector.begin, and this will actually give us the very beginning of our vector, and then comma the value that we want. So we'll just say hello. Okay, and so to prove that this has all worked as well, what we're going to do is we're actually going to print out the entire vector onto the screen. And to do that, we're just going to create a simple loop, just like we did in last episode, but probably with a couple of small differences. So we'll say for size ti is equal to 0, while I, well, that's not I, while I is less than my vector.size I increment by 1. Okay, so there's probably 2 things in here that I didn't show you in the last episode, one of which will be covered in this episode, and the other we will talk about right now. So size t, if you watched last episode about loops, you would have seen that I didn't actually use this. I just used int as the data type for our I variable, but in this case I've actually used t, and the reason for that is sort of when you're dealing with loops where you don't actually know the size of the data that you're retrieving, it's always a good idea to use size t, because basically size t is going to guarantee that you don't go out of range for the variable type that you've actually defined. So if I was to have, well, an example of where this would occur is that if I just said int I, and then my loop was actually pulling, say, I don't know, 1,000,000 records from a database somewhere, then the index of I, or the I's value would actually be out of range for an integer, and then you'd actually get an error. So when you don't actually know the size of the data that you're retrieving, it's always a good idea to use size t. So say if basically if you had a huge database pulling all of these records, you don't know how many records there is, and you just want to be sure that your code's going to work every time and be as portable as possible, then use size t. So size t is a really good habit to get into because it just makes sure that you don't run into errors later on down the track. So just bear that in mind. It's not always necessary, but most of the time it is. Okay, and the other thing is myVector.size. All that does is actually returns the size of the vector. So because vectors are dynamic and you're constantly adding and removing elements and stuff like that, it is quite hard to keep a track of how many elements are actually in the vector. So what vector.size actually does is actually gives you how many elements are actually inside the vector at any given time. So for our loop, what we're going to do is we're going to print out onto the screen my vector at value of I, or at index I. Okay, and then we'll also do a new line so it's easier to read. Okay, and then we should, no, and then we'll run it. And then what we'll get is, hello, my name is Bob Jones. So you can see that we've printed out the two elements that we've actually created. So Jones and hello, both in different places, of course, one at the end and one at the beginning. And that's as simple as that. So that's how you add one, that's how you add elements to vectors, either using its position or just adding one to the end. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this. And then we're actually going to remove some elements from the vector. So to remove the last element from the vector, what we need to do is call my vector dot, instead of push back, we need to say pop back. And this function doesn't actually take any arguments, and all that does is actually remove the last element from the vector. So if we run our program again, we should just get my name is, and no Bob. And then you can see there, my name is. Simple as that. Okay, so then what if you wanted to, say, remove a range, or you wanted to remove a specific element? So to do that, we'll get rid of this, and we'll say my vector dot what is it? Erase is what it is, and then what you need to supply is either the position, so its index position, or a range of elements to remove. So in this case, we're going to remove a range, and what we're going to say is my vector dot begin, and then we're going to go all the way to my vector dot end -1. So what this basically says is we want to erase a range of elements from our vector starting at the beginning and working all the way to the end -1. So we should just get Bob printed out on the screen like we had at the start, and we'll give that a go. Oh, I didn't put a semicolon on the end, so remember to do that. And then we go. So we just got Bob printed out on the screen. And that is pretty much the basics of vectors. So I've showed you guys how to add an element to the end, add an element to any position within the vector, remove an element and remove a range of elements, as well as doing a bit more on loops and explaining the use of size t and also getting the size of your vector. So thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for another episode.